Madison Square Garden. June 25th, 1906. A warm summer evening in New York City. On the rooftop theater, hundreds of well-dressed New Yorkers watched the premiere of a new musical comedy. The show was called Mam'zelle Champagne. Champagne flowed freely. Laughter filled the night air. The orchestra played the final number of the evening, a cheerful tune called I Could Love a Million Girls. At a table near the stage sat Stanford White. He was 52 years old and the most famous architect in America. The very building where he sat was his own creation. He had designed Madison Square Garden 16 years earlier. The tower above him, topped with a golden statue of the goddess Diana, had become a symbol of the city itself. White did not notice the young man in the black overcoat approaching his table. 3 gunshots shattered the summer night. Stanford White slumped forward, dead, before he hit the floor. The shooter stood over the body, pistol raised in the air. He made no attempt to flee. When a policeman reached him moments later, the killer spoke calmly. "He ruined my wife." The man with the gun was Harry Kendall Thaw. He was the heir to a Pittsburgh railroad fortune worth $40 million. His wife was Evelyn Nesbit, the most photographed woman in America. And the dead man at his feet had once been her lover. What followed would become the first trial of the century. It would expose the dark secrets of Gilded Age high society. It would pit old money against new scandal. And at the center of it all stood a young woman whose beauty had captivated 2 powerful men and ultimately destroyed them both. If you appreciate these deep dives into American history, consider subscribing to the channel or joining as a member. Your support makes it possible for us to keep bringing you stories like this one. Now let us go back to the beginning, to a small Pennsylvania town, to a girl born on Christmas Day, and to the extraordinary path that led her from poverty to the most sensational scandal of her age. Chapter 1. The Rise of the Gibson Girl. She was born in 1884 in a small town called Tarentum, Pennsylvania. Her father named her Florence Evelyn Nesbit. The family called her Evelyn. Tarentum sat along the Allegheny River, about 20 miles northeast of Pittsburgh. It was coal country. Smoke from the furnaces darkened the sky. But Winfield Scott Nesbit had ambitions beyond the mills. He was an attorney with a small practice and dreams of a better life for his family. Those dreams died with him. When Evelyn was approximately 10 years old, her father passed away. He left behind a widow, 2 young children, and substantial debts. The family lost everything: their home, their furniture, their place in respectable society. Evelyn's mother found herself alone with no income and no prospects. What followed were years of grinding poverty. The Nesbits moved from boarding house to boarding house. They relied on the charity of relatives. Evelyn's younger brother, Howard, was sent to live with family members who could afford to feed him. Her mother searched desperately for work, but a widow with no skills had few options in 1890s America. Eventually, they settled in Philadelphia. Mrs. Nesbit found work as a sales clerk at Wanamaker's department store. The pay was barely enough to survive. Evelyn, now 14 years old, needed to contribute. She found work at the same store, earning what little she could. Then something unexpected happened. An artist noticed her. Evelyn Nesbit possessed a particular kind of beauty. Her face was heart-shaped, with large expressive eyes and a mass of copper-colored hair. Artists recognized immediately that her features photographed extraordinarily well. In an age before motion pictures, before celebrity magazines, the faces that Americans knew best belonged to artists' models. A local painter asked if she would pose for him. The pay was $1 per session. It was more than she earned in a day at the department store. Her mother agreed. Word spread quickly through Philadelphia's artistic community. Other painters sought her out. Photographers wanted her for their studios. Within months, the teenage girl from Tarentum had become one of the most sought-after models in the city. But Philadelphia was not New York. In 1900, mother and daughter made a decision that would change everything. They moved to Manhattan. Evelyn was 15 or 16 years old, depending on which records you believe. She carried with her a small portfolio of photographs and enormous ambition. New York City in 1900 was the center of American commerce, culture, and society. It was also the center of the publishing industry. Magazines and newspapers consumed images at an unprecedented rate. Advertising was becoming a national phenomenon, and the faces that sold products, that graced magazine covers, that defined American beauty itself, were chosen in New York. Evelyn found work almost immediately. She posed for some of the most respected artists of the era. James Carroll Beckwith painted her. Frederick Church sketched her. Photographers Otto Cerrone and Rudolf Eichermeyer captured her image for mass reproduction. Her face began appearing on magazine covers, on advertisements, on calendars distributed across the country. Then she met Charles Dana Gibson. Gibson was the most influential illustrator in America. His pen and ink drawings of beautiful women had created an entirely new ideal of American femininity. The Gibson girl, as she came to be known, was tall and elegant, confident and modern. She represented everything the new century promised American women. Gibson saw something special in Evelyn Nesbit. He used her as the model for one of his most famous works. The drawing showed a young woman in profile, her abundant hair cascading down to form the shape of a question mark. He titled it, "Woman, the Eternal Question." It became an instant sensation. Evelyn Nesbit was now the Gibson girl. Her face was everywhere. But modeling could not satisfy her ambitions forever. The real money, the real fame, was on the Broadway stage. Her mother initially resisted. The theatre had a questionable reputation. Actresses were not considered entirely respectable. But the potential earnings were too significant to ignore. Some chorus girls, it was whispered, had married millionaires. In July of 1901, Evelyn auditioned for a spot in the chorus of Florodora. The musical comedy had been running at the Casino Theatre on Broadway for months. The Florodora girls, as the chorus was known, had become celebrities in their own right. She got the job. Costumed as a Spanish maiden, the 16-year-old took her place in the back row. The cast nicknamed her Flossie the Fuss. She hated the name. She changed her stage billing to simply Evelyn Nesbit. Within a year, she had moved from the chorus to a featured role. The producer, George Lederer, cast her as the gypsy girl Vashti in a new production called The Wild Rose. The press coverage focused almost entirely on her appearance. Her acting skills were rarely mentioned, but that hardly mattered. Audiences came to see the most beautiful girl in New York. She was 17 years old. She supported her entire family. She was famous from coast to coast. And she had attracted the attention of powerful men. Chapter 2. Stanford White and the American Renaissance. Stanford White was born on November 9, 1853, in New York City. His father, Richard Grant White, was a respected literary critic and Shakespearean scholar. The family had no great fortune, but they possessed something equally valuable. They had connections. The Whites moved in artistic circles. Painters, sculptors, and writers passed through their home. Young Stanford absorbed these influences without ever setting foot in a university. He never received formal training in architecture. Instead, he learned by doing. At 18, He walked into the Boston office of Henry Hobson Richardson. Richardson was the most important architect in America. His bold, Romanesque structures were transforming how Americans thought about public spaces. The young man from New York became his principal assistant. For 6 years, White worked at Richardson's side. He developed an eye for detail and ornament. He discovered his gift for interior spaces, for the placement of objects, for the creation of atmosphere. By 1878, he was ready to make his own mark. He spent a year and a half traveling through Europe. He studied the cathedrals of France and the palaces of Italy. He developed a deep love for the Italian Renaissance, for its elegance and proportion. When he returned to New York in 1879, he carried these influences with him. He joined forces with 2 other young men. Charles Follen McKim had also trained under Richardson. William Rutherford Mead provided business acumen. Together, they founded the firm of McKim, Mead, and White. The timing was perfect. America in the 1880s was entering an era of unprecedented wealth. Railroads, steel, oil, and banking had created a new aristocracy. These families needed homes that reflected their status. They needed structures that announced to the world that America had arrived. McKim, Mead, and White gave them exactly what they wanted. The firm became the architects of the Gilded Age. They created mansions on Fifth Avenue for the Astors and Vanderbilts. They built summer cottages in Newport that rivaled European palaces. Within the partnership, McKim was the scholar, Mead managed the business, and White was the showman. His range was extraordinary. In Newport, he created Rosecliff for the heiress Theresa Fair Ulrichs. The white terracotta mansion took its inspiration from the Grand Trianon at Versailles. In Hyde Park, he conceived a palace for Frederick Vanderbilt overlooking the Hudson River. In Manhattan, his work defined the urban landscape. The Washington Square Arch began as a temporary structure. In 1889, the city celebrated the centennial of George Washington's inauguration. White created a wooden arch to mark the occasion. New Yorkers loved it so much that funds were raised for a permanent version. The marble arch, completed in 1892, still stands today. But his most ambitious project was Madison Square Garden. A syndicate of wealthy investors, including J.P. Morgan and Andrew Carnegie, commissioned White to replace the outdated original. They wanted something spectacular. He gave them a palace. The new Madison Square Garden opened in 1890. It occupied an entire city block. The complex included the largest amphitheater in America, a theater, a concert hall, and a rooftop garden for summer entertainment. Rising above it all was a tower modeled after the Giralda in Seville, Spain. At 341 feet, it dominated the skyline. And at the very top stood Diana. The statue of the goddess was created by Augustus St. Gaudens. Cast in copper and gilded with gold, Diana stood 18 feet tall, holding her bow, rotating with the wind as a weather vane. She caused a scandal. She was nude. Respectable citizens complained. But most New Yorkers simply admired her. She became a symbol of the city itself. Stanford White kept an apartment in the tower beneath her feet. By 1900, White had reached the pinnacle of his profession. He was tall and heavy-set, with red hair and a red mustache. He moved through society with ease, equally at home in Fifth Avenue ballrooms and bohemian studios. He had married well. His wife, Bessie Springs Smith, came from a prominent Long Island family. Their son Lawrence was born in 1887. White's appetites were legendary. He collected art with obsessive passion. He spent money faster than he earned it. He threw elaborate parties. He knew everyone worth knowing. But there was another side to Stanford White. Behind the public brilliance lay private darkness. He pursued pleasure with the same intensity he brought to his profession, and his pleasures had grown troubling. He was drawn to youth, to innocence, to beauty he could possess. In the theatrical world of Broadway, he found opportunity. Young actresses and chorus girls, many of them poor and far from home, found themselves courted by the famous architect. He offered patronage. He offered entry into a world of wealth and glamour. Some of these girls were very young indeed. In 1901, Stanford White was 47 years old. He had created some of the most celebrated structures in America. He dined with millionaires and advised presidents on matters of taste. That same year, he met a 16-year-old chorus girl named Evelyn Nesbit. Chapter 3. The apartment on 24th Street. They met backstage at the Casino Theatre in the autumn of 1901. A fellow performer from Floridora made the introduction. Stanford White was a regular presence in theatrical circles. He attended shows, befriended actresses, and cultivated relationships with newcomers trying to make their way in the city. The other girls knew him as a generous patron. They called him Stanny. Evelyn Nesbit had just turned 16. She was performing in the chorus, earning modest wages. Her face was appearing in magazines across the country. But she remained financially vulnerable, still responsible for her mother and brother. White recognized opportunity. He began by cultivating her mother. He presented himself as a benefactor, a protector of talent. He offered to help the family. He found them a better place to live. He paid for her brother Howard to attend a military academy. He showered them both with gifts and attention. Mrs. Nesbit saw a wealthy patron. She saw security. What she did not see, or chose not to see, was the nature of White's interest in her teenage daughter. White took Evelyn to his private residence. The place was located at 22 West 24th Street, just off Madison Square Park. From the outside, it appeared unremarkable, a simple brick row house on a quiet block. But inside, White had created something entirely different. The building occupied multiple floors and contained a rear entrance for discreet arrivals. White had decorated each room to reflect his aesthetic obsessions. Expensive tapestries hung on the walls. Rare antiques filled every corner. Colored lights cast unusual shadows. It was a space designed for seduction. One room was painted deep green. The walls were lined with mirrors, and from the ceiling hung a red velvet swing, suspended by ropes wrapped in artificial ivy. According to Evelyn's later testimony, White first brought her there with another girl present. He showed them the swing. He encouraged Evelyn to try it. He pushed her higher and higher until her feet kicked through a paper parasol hanging from the ceiling. They all laughed. It seemed like harmless fun. White was patient. He spent weeks building her trust. He took her to fine restaurants. He introduced her to famous people. He made her feel special, chosen, elevated above the other performers scrambling for attention. Her mother approved of every outing. Then came the night that changed everything. According to testimony Evelyn gave years later in court, White invited her over when her mother was away visiting relatives in Pittsburgh. He had arranged for Mrs. Nesbit to make the trip. He wanted Evelyn alone. She testified that he gave her champagne. She had never drunk alcohol before. The bubbles made her dizzy. She described feeling strange, then losing consciousness entirely. When she woke, according to her account, she found herself in a bedroom. The mirrors reflected her confusion. Stanford White sat beside her. She realized what had occurred. She was 16. He was 47. The relationship continued. This is perhaps the most difficult part of the story to understand from a modern perspective. Evelyn did not flee. She did not report what happened. She continued seeing White for more than a year afterward. The reasons were complicated. She had limited options and no independent resources. White controlled access to money, opportunity, and social advancement. He had positioned himself as her protector. Leaving him meant losing everything he provided. There was also something else. According to statements Evelyn made late in her life, she developed genuine feelings for him. He could be charming and attentive. He introduced her to a world of art and beauty she had never experienced. Many years later, she would say that Stanford White was the only man she ever truly loved. Whether this was truth or the complicated memory of an elderly woman looking back on her youth, we cannot know. What we do know is that their relationship was observed. Theatre people talked. Rumors circulated. White made little effort to hide his attachment. He took her to public events. He displayed her like another acquisition for his collection. Word reached a man from Pittsburgh. Harry Kendall Thaw had seen Evelyn perform in the Wild Rose. He had become fixated on her beauty. He had sent flowers and letters. He had tried repeatedly to meet her, and he had heard the stories about Stanford White. White considered Thaw a nuisance. He warned Evelyn to stay away from the strange millionaire. He told her Thaw was dangerous, that his reputation in certain circles was troubling. But he did not share specifics. Perhaps he did not know them. Perhaps he simply underestimated the threat. By 1903, the relationship between White and Nesbit had cooled. He had moved on to other interests. She had grown from a naive teenager into a seasoned performer of 19. The dynamics between them shifted. Stanford White had no idea what he had set in motion. A triangle had formed. At its points stood an architect, a performer, and an heir to millions. Two of them would be destroyed. The third would spend the rest of her life haunted by what came next. Chapter 4. The Thaw Fortune. The Thaw family mansion sat on a hill overlooking Pittsburgh. They called it Lyndhurst. It was a gloomy stone fortress, dark and imposing, filled with heavy furniture and old money respectability. Here Harry Kendall Thaw spent his childhood. Here his troubles began. His father, William Thaw Sr., had built one of the great American fortunes. The elder Thaw started in canal boats before the Civil War, then recognized that railroads would transform the nation. He invested heavily in the Pennsylvania Railroad and watched his wealth multiply. Coal, iron, and steel interests followed. By the time of his death in 1889, William Thaw had accumulated riches that placed his household among the wealthiest in America. Harry was born on February 12, 1871. He was the eldest surviving son of his father's second marriage to Mary Sibbett Copley. The Copley line had its own history of instability. Mary herself was known for violent outbursts and cruel treatment of servants. She adored Harry. She protected him. She refused to acknowledge that anything was wrong with her son, but something was clearly wrong. From his earliest years, Harry exhibited troubling behavior. He suffered from insomnia and nightmares. He threw violent tantrums that continued long past the age when such outbursts should have stopped. He babbled incoherently, sometimes lapsing into baby talk even as a teenager. Servants learned to stay out of his way. His favorite amusement, according to later accounts, was throwing heavy objects at their heads. Teachers found him impossible. One instructor at the Worcester Preparatory School described the 16-year-old Harry as having a peculiar zigzag walk that seemed to mimic the erratic patterns of his mind. He bounced from one private school to another across Pittsburgh. None could handle him. None wanted him back. His father's money opened doors that talent and temperament would have kept shut. Harry gained admission to the University of Pittsburgh, then called the Western University of Pennsylvania. He was supposed to study law. He apparently studied very little. After a few unproductive years, his surname secured him a transfer to Harvard College. Harvard proved no different. Harry later bragged that he studied poker at Harvard. He reportedly lit his cigars with $100 bills to impress classmates. He went on extended drinking binges. He attended cockfights. He spent most of his time pursuing actresses and chorus girls in Boston. His academic performance was non-existent. The end came abruptly. Harvard expelled him for what the administration termed immoral practices, along with intimidating and threatening fellow students and faculty. The specific incidents were never made public. The Thaws paid to keep them quiet. This would become a pattern. In 1894, Harry reportedly chased a cab driver down a Philadelphia street with a shotgun. The dispute was over 10 cents in change. He claimed afterward that the weapon was unloaded. The incident disappeared from the newspapers. Money changed hands. Silence was purchased. When William Thaw Sr. died, he left Harry a substantial inheritance. Estimates placed it between $3 and $5 million, with additional income from trusts. For most people, such wealth would have provided comfort and security for a lifetime. For Harry, it provided the means to indulge his worst impulses without consequence. He divided his time between Pittsburgh and New York. In Manhattan, he pursued the life of a society gentleman. He applied for membership in the most exclusive establishments: the Metropolitan, the Century, the Knickerbocker, the Players. All rejected him. The Union League briefly admitted him, then revoked his membership after he rode a horse up the front steps into the entrance hall. Harry became convinced that someone was sabotaging him. He decided that Stanford White was responsible. White moved in the highest circles of New York society. White knew everyone. White, Harry believed, was poisoning his reputation, spreading stories, blocking his acceptance into the world where he belonged. There is no evidence that White gave Harry Thaw any thought at all during this period. To White, if he noticed him, Thaw was simply another eccentric rich man cluttering the edges of society. He reportedly referred to Thaw as the Pennsylvania Pug, a dismissive reference to his soft, babyish features. But in Harry's mind, Stanford White had become an enemy. A powerful enemy. An enemy who must eventually be confronted. By 1901, Harry Thaw was 30 years old. He had never held a job. He had never completed an education. He had never formed a lasting relationship. He had spent a decade burning through money and accumulating grievances. He needed something to focus his restless, disordered mind. He found it on a Broadway stage. Chapter 5. An Obsessive Pursuit. Her name was everywhere in 1902, on magazine covers, in newspaper columns, on the lips of men who fancied themselves connoisseurs of beauty. Harry Thaw became one of those men. He first noticed Evelyn Nesbit when she appeared in The Wild Rose at the Knickerbocker Theatre. The production had opened in the spring of 1902, and Nesbit played a gypsy girl named Vashti. She was 18 years old, no longer in the chorus, but a featured performer with her name on the billing. Thaw sat in the audience that first night. He returned the next evening, and the next. Over the following months, he purchased tickets to approximately 40 performances. He memorized her movements on stage. He learned which scenes featured her most prominently. He timed his arrivals to coincide with her appearances. The object of his attention had no idea he existed. Thaw understood that a direct approach would fail. A man with his reputation could not simply present himself to the most celebrated performer in the city. He needed a strategy. He invented one. Through an intermediary, Thaw arranged an introduction. But he did not use his real name. He called himself Mr. Monroe. He dressed conservatively. He spoke softly. He presented himself as a gentleman of modest means who simply admired her talent. Nesbit found him odd but harmless. He was polite and persistent. He showered her with gifts and attention, always maintaining the fiction that he was this mysterious Mr. Monroe. She accepted his offerings without much thought. Wealthy admirers were common in theatrical life. Every performer had stories. The deception continued for weeks. Finally, Thaw revealed himself. According to accounts from the period, he confronted Nesbit one evening and announced with considerable drama that he was not Monroe at all. He was Harry Kendall Thaw of Pittsburgh. Did she not recognize the name? She did. Everyone in theatrical circles knew of the Thaw Fortune. Everyone had heard rumors about the eccentric heir who scattered money across Manhattan. Nesbit was unimpressed. She found his elaborate deception bewildering rather than romantic. The revelation changed nothing. She continued to regard him as merely another admirer, more persistent than most, but ultimately insignificant. Thaw would not accept insignificance. He investigated her circumstances. Stanford White had been her protector. Whispers circulated about their relationship. Details emerged, real and imagined, about what had transpired between the architect and the young performer. The information consumed him. White, meanwhile, had noticed Thaw's attentions. He warned Nesbit to keep her distance, told her that Thaw was dangerous, that stories circulated about his treatment of women. But White offered no specifics. He spoke in generalities. Nesbit, who had learned not to trust powerful men who claimed to protect her, received the warning with skepticism. Perhaps she wondered why White cared. Their own relationship had cooled. He had moved on to other interests. She was no longer his concern. Why should he involve himself? Thaw continued his campaign. In the summer of 1903, Nesbit fell ill. She was hospitalized with what was reported as appendicitis, though some accounts suggest other causes. The illness required extended recovery. She was confined to bed, weak and vulnerable, cut off from her usual circles. Thaw saw his opportunity. He arrived bearing flowers and expensive gifts. The nurses found him charming. The headmistress at the boarding school where Nesbit had been staying was impressed by his apparent devotion. Day after day he appeared at her bedside, attentive and solicitous, asking nothing except her company. Nesbit was isolated. Her mother had limited resources. Stanford White had faded from her life. The theatrical world seemed distant from a hospital bed. And here was this wealthy man offering comfort and security. She began to see him differently. When she recovered, Thaw proposed marriage. It was June of 1903. She was 19 years old. He was 32. She refused. According to accounts she gave later, Nesbit told Thaw she was unworthy of marriage. She confessed what had happened with Stanford White. She described the champagne, the night she lost consciousness. She told him everything. She expected him to leave. Instead, his interest intensified. What Nesbit intended as a confession became, for Thaw, confirmation. Here was proof. Stanford White was a villain. Stanford White had violated this woman. Stanford White must be exposed, punished, destroyed. His fixation on Nesbit and his hatred of White fused into a single burning purpose. He would not stop pursuing her. And she, worn down and seeing few alternatives, would eventually relent. Chapter 6. The Marriage. In the autumn of 1903, Harry Thaw made Evelyn Nesbit an offer. He would take her to Europe. Paris, London, the Alps. She would travel in luxury, far from the pressures of New York, far from the memories that haunted her. All he asked was her companionship. She accepted. Escape, opportunity, desperation. Any of these might explain her decision. Nesbit was 20 years old. Her theatrical career had stalled. Her relationship with Stanford White was over. Her family remained dependent on whatever income she could provide. A European tour with a millionaire must have seemed preferable to the grind of auditions and boarding houses. They sailed in the summer of 1903, accompanied by a chaperone and Nesbit's mother. Thaw paid for everything: first-class cabins, the finest hotels, gowns and jewelry. For a young woman who had grown up in poverty, the experience was intoxicating. But the trip had another purpose. Thaw wanted details. He pressed Nesbit repeatedly about Stanford White. He demanded she recount every interaction, every evening, every moment she had spent with the architect. He wanted specifics about the apartment on 24th Street. He wanted to hear it again and again. According to testimony Nesbit gave years later in court, Thaw's behavior changed when they were alone. She alleged that at a rented castle in the Austrian Alps, Thaw revealed a different side of himself. Behind closed doors, away from witnesses, he subjected her to physical abuse. She described being confined to rooms for days. She described being struck, being whipped. She alleged that Thaw carried implements specifically for this purpose. These allegations emerged during the murder trials and have never been independently verified. Thaw denied them throughout his life. What happened in Austria remains disputed. What is certain is that Nesbit returned from Europe and continued seeing Thaw. She had no independent means. Returning to the theatre meant starting over. Her mother offered no guidance. Stanford White had moved on. Harry Thaw, for all his faults, represented security. There was also the matter of reputation. Nesbit had travelled alone with Thaw for months. In the moral climate of the era, this fact alone compromised her. Marriage had become almost necessary to restore respectability. Thaw continued pressing his suit. For nearly 2 years, he pursued her with the same relentless determination he had shown from the beginning. Letters arrived constantly. Promises multiplied. He spoke of his plans to expose Stanford White, to bring the architect to justice for what he had done. His mother was another matter entirely. Mary Thaw wanted nothing to do with Evelyn Nesbit. She considered the former chorus girl beneath her son, a fortune hunter, a woman of questionable morals. She had spent decades protecting Harry from the consequences of his behavior. She had paid off accusers and silenced witnesses. She had no intention of welcoming this particular problem into her household. But Harry insisted. In early 1905, Mary Thaw finally relented. Some accounts suggest she believed marriage might stabilize her troubled son. Others indicate she simply could not resist his demands any longer. Whatever her reasoning, she gave her consent. The wedding took place on April 4th, 1905. The ceremony was held at the Third Presbyterian Church in Pittsburgh. Reverend Dr. Matteawan officiated. The bride was 20 years old. The groom was 34. Mary Thaw did not attend. She remained at Lyndhurst, unwilling to witness her son marry a woman she despised. The newspapers reported the event with restrained curiosity. Harry Kendall Thaw, heir to one of Pittsburgh's great fortunes, had married Evelyn Nesbit, the famous model and actress. The coverage noted her beauty and his wealth. It did not mention his history of instability. It did not mention her history with Stanford White. Those details would emerge later. The newlyweds moved into Lyndhurst. For Nesbit, life in the Thaw mansion was suffocating. Mother Thaw ruled the household with rigid propriety. Evelyn was expected to abandon her theatrical past. to become a respectable Pittsburgh wife. She was monitored, controlled, confined to domestic routines that left her isolated and miserable. Harry himself seemed to lose interest in his new bride almost immediately. He disappeared for days at a time. He traveled to New York without her. He resumed his old habits. But his fixation on Stanford White did not diminish. Thaw had begun corresponding with Anthony Comstock, the notorious anti-vice crusader who led the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice. Comstock had made a career of prosecuting obscenity and moral corruption. Thaw fed him information about White, about the apartment, about the young women who had passed through it. He wanted White destroyed. He imagined himself a moral avenger, defending innocent womanhood against depravity. Letters, testimony, funded investigations. The campaign consumed him. It went nowhere. White was too prominent, too connected. Comstock could not, or would not, pursue the matter. Thaw seethed. By the spring of 1906, he had been married for a year. His wife was unhappy. His crusade had failed. His enemy remained untouched, still moving through New York society, still attending openings and parties, still living as though nothing had happened. Harry Thaw decided to take matters into his own hands. Chapter 7, June 25th, 1906. The morning of June 25th, 1906, was hot and humid. New York sweltered under a summer haze. Harry and Evelyn Thaw had been in the city for several days, staying at hotels, attending shows. They were scheduled to sail for Europe the following evening. That night, they had dinner at Café Martin on 26th Street. Joining them were two acquaintances, Thomas McCaleb and Truxton Beale. The conversation was light. Nothing in Thaw's behavior suggested what was coming. After dinner, the party discussed their options for the evening. Evelyn mentioned that the new musical revue Mam'zelle Champagne was opening at Madison Square Garden. The rooftop theatre there offered entertainment and relief from the heat. Thaw agreed to attend. They arrived at the venue around 10:30. The rooftop garden sat atop the building Stanford White had designed 16 years earlier. Thaw knew this. He almost certainly knew that White frequented the venue. Whether he expected to find the architect there that night remains uncertain. The Thaws took a table near the stage. The show was already underway. Performers moved through comic sketches and musical numbers. The audience laughed and applauded. Waiters circulated with drinks. Stanford White arrived late. He came alone and took a table close to the stage, perhaps 50 feet from where the Thaws were seated. If he noticed Harry Thaw in the crowd, he gave no indication. Thaw noticed him immediately. According to witnesses, Thaw became agitated. He stood and sat repeatedly. He stared at White's table. Evelyn later testified that she tried to calm him, suggested they leave. Thaw refused. The show continued toward its finale. The performers began the closing number, a song called "I Could Love a Million Girls." The singer moved across the stage. The hour had just passed 11. Harry Thaw rose from his seat. He walked directly toward Stanford White's table. His right hand was inside his overcoat. White sat with his back partially turned, watching the stage. He did not see Thaw approach. Thaw stopped within arm's reach of the architect. He drew a pistol. He extended his arm and fired 3 shots into Stanford White's face at point-blank range. The first bullet entered above the left eye. White was killed instantly. His body pitched forward onto the table, then slid to the floor. The gunshots silenced the music. Screams erupted across the rooftop. Thaw stood motionless for a moment. Then he raised the pistol above his head, barrel pointing toward the ceiling. He turned and walked back toward his wife. Witnesses heard him speak. The exact words vary by account. Some reported he said, "I did it because he ruined my wife." Others recalled, "He had it coming to him." Still others heard simply, "He deserved it." Evelyn sat frozen at their table. Thaw reached her and said something inaudible. A fireman on duty at the venue approached and took the pistol from Thaw's hand. Thaw offered no resistance. He seemed calm, almost relieved. Within minutes, police officers arrived. Thaw was placed under arrest. As they led him away, he reportedly told an officer that White had ruined his life and deserved to die. On the rooftop floor, Stanford White's body lay where it had fallen. He was 52 years old. The building around him, the tower with its golden Diana, the amphitheater that had made Madison Square Garden famous. He had designed all of it. Now his blood pooled on the tiles of his own creation. The next morning, every newspaper in America carried the story. What followed would transfix the nation for years. Chapter 8. The First Trial. Harry Thaw spent his first night as a murderer in the Tombs, Manhattan's notorious city prison. The facility sat on Center Street, a grim stone structure that had housed criminals for decades. Thaw was given a private cell. His mother's money ensured he would not share quarters with common prisoners. Outside, the newspapers exploded. The story had everything editors craved: wealth, beauty, sex, violence, high society scandal. Within days, the murder of Stanford White became the most discussed event in America. Reporters dug into every corner of the three lives that had collided on that rooftop. They interviewed neighbors, former servants, theatrical colleagues. They published photographs of Evelyn in her chorus girl days. They speculated about what had happened in the apartment on 24th Street. Public opinion divided sharply. Some viewed Thaw as a hero who had avenged his wife's honor. Others saw him as a lunatic who had executed an unarmed man. The debate played out in editorials, in saloons, in parlors across the country. The trial began in January of 1907. Thaw's defense team was led by Delphine Delmas, a flamboyant California attorney known for theatrical courtroom performances. Delmas faced a difficult task. The facts of the killing were not in dispute. Hundreds of witnesses had seen Thaw fire 3 shots into Stanford White's face. The only question was whether Thaw should be held responsible. Delmas crafted an unusual strategy. He would argue that Thaw had been temporarily insane at the moment of the shooting, driven mad by the knowledge of what White had done to his wife. This was not ordinary insanity. This was something uniquely American. Delmas called it dementia Americana. The term was his own invention. He defined it as a species of insanity that overtook American men when they learned that their wives had been violated. It was, he argued, an uncontrollable impulse rooted in the American character. Thaw had not committed murder. He had acted as any honorable American husband would act. The argument was legally dubious, but Delmas was not speaking only to the jury. He was speaking to the newspapers, to the public, to a nation following every moment of the proceedings. Evelyn Thaw took the stand. For days, she testified about her relationship with Stanford White. She described meeting him at 16. She described the apartment with its velvet swing. She described the night he gave her champagne and she lost consciousness. Her testimony was detailed, emotional, and widely reprinted. The prosecution pushed back. District Attorney William Travers Jerome subjected Evelyn to harsh cross-examination. He suggested she was lying to save her husband. He implied that her relationship with White had been consensual. Evelyn held firm. The trial stretched for months. Alienists testified about Thaw's mental state. Some declared him insane. Others found him perfectly rational. The expert testimony contradicted itself repeatedly. In April of 1907, the case went to the jury. They deliberated for hours. They took multiple votes. They could not agree. 7 jurors wanted conviction for first-degree murder. 5 believed Thaw was not guilty by reason of insanity. Neither side would yield. The judge declared a mistrial. Harry Thaw was returned to the Tombs to await a second trial. New lawyers would be hired. New strategies would be attempted. The nation was not finished with Harry Thaw. Chapter 9. The Verdict. The second trial began on January 6, 1908. Harry Thaw had spent nearly 2 years in the Tombs awaiting this moment. His mother had paid for comfortable accommodations, meals from fine restaurants, regular visits from family and attorneys. But even money could not purchase freedom. Only a jury could do that. The defense team had changed completely. Delphine Delmas was gone, replaced by Martin Littleton, a New York attorney with a different approach. Where Delmas had been theatrical, Littleton was methodical. Where Delmas had invented new legal theories, Littleton worked within established frameworks. The strategy shifted as well. Littleton did not attempt to argue that Thaw had been sane before and after the murder, but temporarily insane during it. Instead, he presented a simpler case. Harry Thaw suffered from a mental disease. That disease had rendered him incapable of understanding that his actions were wrong. Therefore, he was not guilty by reason of insanity. This was a gamble. An insanity verdict would spare Thaw the electric chair, but it would not set him free. It would send him to an asylum, potentially for life. The Thaw family had to weigh execution against indefinite confinement. They chose confinement. Evelyn testified again. Her story remained consistent. She described Stanford White's pursuit of her, the night at the apartment, her confession to Harry. The jury heard what the first jury had heard. But this time, the defense did not ask them to believe in dementia Americana. They asked only that the jury accept what seemed obvious. Harry Thaw was mentally ill. District Attorney Jerome prosecuted with the same vigor he had shown in the first trial. He attacked Evelyn's credibility. He presented witnesses who described Thaw as calculating and deliberate. He argued that Thaw had planned the murder, that he had stalked White for months, that he had chosen the moment carefully. The trial lasted less than a month. On February 1st, 1908, the jury returned its verdict. Not guilty by reason of insanity. Thaw showed no visible reaction. He had escaped the death penalty, but he had not escaped punishment. Judge Victor Dowling immediately ordered Thaw committed to the Matteawan State Hospital for the criminally insane. The facility sat in Fishkill, New York, roughly 60 miles north of Manhattan. It housed the most dangerous and disturbed criminal defendants in the state. Harry Thaw would join them. The newspapers reacted with predictable intensity. Some praised the verdict as justice for a wronged husband. Others condemned it as a miscarriage that allowed a murderer to escape true accountability. Editorial writers debated whether wealth had purchased a favorable outcome. For Evelyn, the verdict brought complications. She had stood by her husband through 2 trials. She had testified on his behalf, endured public scrutiny, faced accusations that she was a liar and a fortune hunter. Now her husband was locked away in an asylum with no clear path to release. The Thaw family made their position clear. They blamed Evelyn for Harry's troubles. If she had not been involved with Stanford White, none of this would have happened. Mary Thaw, in particular, viewed her daughter-in-law with contempt. Evelyn found herself isolated. Her theatrical career had been destroyed by scandal. Her husband was institutionalized. Her in-laws wanted nothing to do with her. The money that had once flowed freely began to slow. At Matteawan, Harry Thaw settled into a new routine. The facility was grim, but not unbearable. His family's wealth ensured certain privileges. He had a private room. He received visitors. He was not subjected to the harshest treatments available to asylum doctors of the era. But he was not free. Thaw immediately began planning his release. He hired attorneys to petition for his sanity. He wrote letters to officials, to newspapers, to anyone who might help his cause. He insisted that he was not insane, that he had never been insane, that the verdict had been a legal strategy rather than a medical truth. The courts disagreed. In 1910, his petition for release was denied. The judge ruled that Thaw remained a danger to himself and others. Harry Thaw would spend 5 years at Matteawan before finding another way out. Chapter 10. Escape from Matteawan. 5 years in an asylum had not broken Harry Thaw. It had only sharpened his determination to escape. Life at Matteawan was not unbearable. His family's money bought privileges, a private room, decent food, regular visitors. But it was still confinement. Every petition for release had failed. The courts continued to rule that Harry Thaw remained a danger to society. In 1910, Evelyn gave birth to a son. She named him Russell William Thaw and claimed Harry was the father, conceived during a conjugal visit. Thaw denied paternity. The child became another point of contention between them. By 1912, their marriage had collapsed entirely. A third sanity hearing was convened to determine whether Thaw could be released. Evelyn appeared, but not as his advocate. She testified against her husband. She told the court that Harry had threatened to kill her if he were ever set free. The judges returned him to Matteawan. If the legal system would not release him, Thaw decided, he would release himself. On the morning of August 17th, 1913, a milk cart arrived at the asylum's front gate. At 7:30, an attendant opened the gate to allow the delivery inside. As the cart entered, Harry Thaw ran out. A black Packard touring car sat idling nearby. Thaw jumped inside. The car accelerated away, heading north at speeds reportedly reaching 70 miles per hour. The escape had been carefully planned. Thaw's family was suspected of orchestrating the entire operation, though this was never proven. The driver knew the route. Within hours, they had crossed into Massachusetts, then continued north through the Berkshires. By the time authorities realized what had happened, Thaw was gone. The manhunt made national headlines. Police across the Northeast went on alert. Evelyn, now performing in vaudeville, was placed under protection. Newspapers speculated about where Thaw might be headed. He was headed for Canada. On August 19th, Thaw crossed the border near Coaticook, Quebec. Canadian authorities promptly arrested him in Sherbrooke. For a moment, it seemed his escape had failed. But Thaw had resources. His lawyers arrived and began fighting extradition. They argued that Canada had no obligation to return him to an American asylum. The legal battle dragged on for months. The Canadian government wanted nothing to do with Harry Thaw. In the end, they dispensed with legal niceties. Late one night, police officers and an immigration inspector broke into Thaw's hotel room. They forced him to dress, dragged him to a waiting car, and drove him to the border. There they pushed him back onto American soil. Thaw found himself in New Hampshire, then was transferred through various jurisdictions as officials debated what to do with him. His lawyers continued their work. New hearings were scheduled. New experts examined his mental state. The legal proceedings consumed another year. Finally, in the summer of 1915, a jury was convened to determine whether Harry Thaw was sane. After hearing testimony from alienists on both sides, they reached their verdict. Harry Kendall Thaw was sane. On July 16th, 1915, he walked out of custody a free man. 9 years after murdering Stanford White, he had finally escaped the consequences. He was 44 years old. He had spent nearly a decade in prisons and asylums. His wife had divorced him. His reputation was destroyed. But he still had his family's money, and he still had his demons. Freedom would not last. Chapter 11. The Final Decades. Harry Thaw's freedom lasted 18 months. In December of 1915, just 5 months after his release, Thaw met a 19-year-old named Frederick Gump at an ice cream parlor in Long Beach, California. Gump came from a respectable Kansas City family. He was young, impressionable, and flattered by the attention of a wealthy older man. Thaw spent the next year cultivating the relationship, befriending the entire Gump family, and presenting himself as a generous benefactor who wanted to help the young man succeed. Thaw eventually convinced the family to send Frederick to New York. He promised to sponsor the teenager's enrollment at Carnegie Institute and arranged rooms for him at the Hotel McAlpin in Manhattan. Frederick Gump arrived expecting opportunity. He found something else entirely. On Christmas Eve of 1916, Thaw attacked the young man in the hotel room. According to newspaper accounts, Gump was confronted by Thaw, armed with a short whip, rushing toward him. The beating was severe. The assault went beyond violence into territory that newspapers of the era declined to describe explicitly. Gump managed to escape the following day and fled back to Kansas, where he eventually told his family what had happened. When police issued a warrant for Thaw's arrest, he ran. Authorities tracked him to Philadelphia, where they found him in a hotel room. He had attempted suicide by slashing his own throat. The wound was not fatal. Thaw's first response was to reach for his checkbook. He offered the Gump family $500,000 to drop all charges. They refused. The case proceeded to trial, and once again, Harry Thaw faced judgment for violence he could not control. His mother intervened one final time. Mary Thaw arranged for her son to be declared insane by the Pennsylvania Commission on Lunacy, which allowed him to be committed to a state hospital rather than extradited to New York for criminal prosecution. It was the same strategy she had employed for decades, using money and influence to shield her son from the full consequences of his actions. Harry was sent to Kirkbride Asylum in Philadelphia, where he would remain for the next 7 years under close supervision. In April of 1924, at the age of 53, Harry Thaw was declared sane and released. He had now spent more than 15 years of his adult life confined to asylums and prisons. The murder of Stanford White was nearly 2 decades in the past. His mother continued to support him until her death in 1929. Mary Copley Thaw was 86 years old. She had spent the final 23 years of her life protecting her son from the consequences of murder, escape, and assault. The newspapers noted that Harry was deeply affected by her passing. She had been, in the end, the only person who never abandoned him. The remaining years of his life passed in relative obscurity. In 1926, Thaw published a memoir titled The Traitor, a rambling account that portrayed him as a heroic defender of innocent womanhood. The traitor of the title was not Stanford White or Evelyn Nesbit, but rather the defense attorney whose insanity plea had denied Thaw the vindication he believed he deserved. The book found few readers. He dabbled in film production. He drifted through society, no longer welcomed in the circles he had once desperately sought to enter. Periodically, his name appeared in newspapers in connection with lawsuits filed by showgirls who alleged he had beaten them. The pattern of his behavior never changed. Only the consequences grew smaller as his notoriety faded. Eventually, Thaw retired to Florida, living off what remained of his inheritance. He never remarried. He never expressed remorse for killing Stanford White. In his own mind, he remained a righteous man who had done what any husband would do. Harry Kendall Thaw died in Miami on February 22, 1947. He was 76 years old. The cause was cardiac arrest. The newspapers noted his passing with brief obituaries that recounted the scandal of 4 decades earlier. Most Americans under 40 had never heard of him. His will contained one final gesture toward the woman whose testimony had twice saved him from the electric chair. He left Evelyn Nesbit $10,000, approximately 1% of his remaining estate. It was the only acknowledgement she would receive from the fortune she had helped him keep. Chapter 12. What Became of Evelyn. Evelyn Nesbit had saved her husband from the electric chair. In return, she received abandonment. After the second trial ended in 1908, the Thaw family cut off nearly all financial support. The payments she had received during the proceedings, never generous to begin with, simply stopped. She had served her purpose. Harry was alive and confined to an asylum rather than awaiting execution. The Thaws no longer needed her testimony or her cooperation. They certainly did not want her as part of their family. She divorced Thaw in 1915, the same year he was finally released from custody. By then, their marriage existed only on paper. She had not seen him in years, except during legal proceedings. The divorce freed her legally, but left her with nothing. No settlement, no alimony, no share of the fortune she had helped preserve. She was 30 years old, notorious throughout America, and essentially unemployable in respectable society. Evelyn did what she had always done. She returned to performing. Vaudeville stages across the country welcomed her, not for her talent, but for her infamy. Audiences paid to see the woman at the center of the trial of the century. She danced. She posed. She traded on her scandalous past because it was the only currency she possessed. In 1916, she married her dance partner Jack Clifford, hoping perhaps for stability and partnership. He left her 2 years later. The 1920s brought deeper struggles. Evelyn opened a tea room in Manhattan that failed within months. She drifted into speakeasies and burlesque stages, performing for crowds who remembered her name but had forgotten why. She battled alcoholism and morphine addiction, demons that would haunt her for more than a decade. In 1926, despondent after losing a job at a Chicago nightclub, she swallowed disinfectant in a suicide attempt. She survived. Harry Thaw, who had kept her under surveillance through private detectives even after their divorce, learned of the incident and visited her in the hospital. The newspapers speculated about reconciliation. Nothing came of it. Throughout these years, she raised her son Russell largely alone. The boy Thaw had refused to acknowledge grew into a young man who made his own path. During the Second World War, Russell Thaw became a decorated pilot, earning recognition for his service. He built a life entirely separate from the scandal that had defined his mother's existence. Evelyn published 2 memoirs attempting to tell her own story. The first, The Story of My Life, appeared in 1914, while the trials were still fresh in public memory. The second, Prodigal Days, followed in 1934. Neither made her wealthy. Neither fully rehabilitated her reputation. She remained, in the public imagination, the girl on the red velvet swing, the beauty whose face had launched a murder. After Harry Thaw died in 1947, Evelyn left New York and moved to California to be near her son. She settled in Los Angeles and enrolled at the Grant Beach School of Arts and Crafts, pursuing a long-standing interest in sculpture and ceramics. She graduated in 1952 and began teaching classes. It was quiet work, anonymous work, the kind of life she had never known during her years of fame. In 1955, Hollywood came calling one last time. 20th Century Fox was producing a film about her early life called The Girl in the Red Velvet Swing, starring Joan Collins. Evelyn served as technical advisor on the production and received $10,000 for her participation. The film blended fact with fiction, as such films always do, but it brought her name back into public conversation briefly. She collapsed from exhaustion during the production and suffered a stroke the following year. The final decade of her life passed in increasing obscurity. Evelyn lived in a small downtown Los Angeles hotel, then moved to a nursing home in Santa Monica as her health declined. She had outlived Stanford White by more than 60 years. She had outlived Harry Thaw by 20. She had outlived nearly everyone who remembered what she had looked like at 16, when artists competed to paint her, and powerful men competed for her attention. Evelyn Nesbit died on January 17, 1967. She was 82 years old. Only a handful of people attended her funeral at Holy Cross Cemetery. The newspapers printed brief obituaries noting her connection to the murder that had made her famous 6 decades earlier. Most Americans had never heard of her. Near the end of her life, she was asked about Stanford White. Her answer carried the weight of everything she had endured. "Stanny White was killed," she said, "but my fate was worse. I lived."